Happy New Year. Welcome to 2022, Good Thinkers. I am very happy to welcome everyone to the new year and to a new year of good thinking and a year of continuing to steal a little bit of time away from all the time we are told what to think so we can luxuriate in giving ourselves a little bit of time to think about our thinking, metacognition, thinking about improving how we think. And I think advice is a really good way to start because advice is so often what to think or what to do. And when you turn it on its head to start with how to think, to create these mental models for improving how we think, then we can begin to differentiate between good advice and bad advice, which is today's topic. So, to start off with, let me know who you are and where you're from. We've got rubber chickens. For those of you new to good thinking, rubber chickens for participation and particularly interesting comments and questions. So let us know in the stream who you are and where you're from. We've got Berkeley joining from DC. And I think I read that DC is being inundated with snow today. So welcome from DC. Let us know who you are and where you're from. Okay. Now, our feeds, for those of you who are in the social media and following and whatever, whether you're on YouTube here or whether you're coming from LinkedIn, our feeds, right? Our feeds are packed with career and lifestyle influencers, all who promote their ideologies through inspiration and self-promotion and advice. And these accounts promise to change our lives, to become thought leaders, to attract thousands of or millions of followers. All right. When it comes to distinguishing between good and bad advice, would you rather A, know how to think about giving good advice, or B, think about your thinking and how to receive good advice? Would you rather be someone who's really proficient in giving good advice or receiving good advice, or being able to distinguish between giving good advice and bad advice, or receiving good advice and bad advice? Okay, I'm going to say hi to some good thinkers. Abdurrachid, welcome. Welcome. Happy New Year. Happy New Year, Ray from Pennsylvania, and Alan from San Jose, and Hatem from Belgium. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We've got good thinkers coming on from all over the world, which is great because this gives us a much better perspective than if we all come from the same place and believe the same things. But the one thing that we all do kind of luxuriate in, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we all like to spend a little bit of time to think about our thinking and not be too precious about it either. Sometimes we have to really interrogate. So, quick question, first question. A, when you think about the differentiation between good and bad advice, do you think in terms of a giver of good advice or a receiver of good or bad advice? A, giver, B, receiver. Let me know what interests you most. Now, if you answered A, there's a couple of ways of thinking about it. Okay. So if you answered A, let's see. Stephen says, greetings from today, what feels like the wettest place on earth. Yes, very, very, very rainy and wet in Portland, Oregon after a week of snow. Ray says, giving good advice because I could get good advice by giving good advice. Ooh, I like it. I like it. I like it. I like it. I love it. Really interesting. And I think I agree with the perspective. Now, if you answered A, you can think about advice when you're giving advice, and sometimes you think you're giving advice, but you're giving a little bit of something else. And this is kind of the theme for today, is differentiating between appreciation, evaluation, or feedback, and advice. So if you think about giving advice, do you prefer to give appreciation to motivate, give evaluation to rate performance, or give advice to guide or improve performance? Because I know a lot of people don't like giving feedback. And this is an interesting thing. Like if you read a lot in Harvard Business Review, they'll say, if you want feedback, don't ask for feedback, ask for advice. Do you agree or disagree? You agree or disagree? All right, Jennifer, welcome, Jennifer. Jennifer says she'd like both. She'd like to be able to think about how to give and how to get good and bad advice. Perfect, because it really does relate. So I think that's perfectly fine. Now, if you answer B, you really want to know how to differentiate or distinguish between good and bad advice. What are you seeking? You have to know what you're seeking, because how many times do you ask for advice when you think you've just knocked something out of the park, but what you're really asking for is appreciation? So you're asking for advice, but what you really want is confirmation. Or you're asking for advice, but what you really want is feedback. What is the difference? Well, once you think about these things differently, the difference between feedback, giving and receiving, the difference between advice, giving and receiving, and the difference between appreciation, those three things, once you think about how they're different, there's overlap for sure, you start to see the light that shines on how to distinguish between good and bad advice. And you can think of advice in three ways. All right. How do you know if advice is meant for you? So one of the ways is this advice meant for me? So when you read about all these things, like you've got to do this, you've got to build your brand, you've got to get your Twitter followers up, you've got to get your LinkedIn followers up, and you think, oh, I've got to do that. I've got to have a personal brand and a platform. How do you know if this advice is meant for you? So when you get advice, how do you know if it's meant for you? Let me know in the chat. I'm taking off this banner so we can have room for the comments, because I want comments. How do you know? How do you, not like hypothetically, but like, how do you know when advice is meant for you? So which resonates with you more? Let me just ask you this. Which resonates with you more? A, you need to set goals and be a gunner. You need to go, 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 set goals. And I don't mean this in a bad way. You need to set goals and follow through on your goals. Or you need to relax and go with the flow. So A, you need to set goals and go, go, go. And B, you need to relax and go with the flow. What resonates more with you? Okay, we're going to say hi to YouTuber. Welcome. And we've got Loya. Appreciation is a booster, but when evaluation helps to know where we stand and helps to improve better in an efficient way. Excellent. The key is when you're asking and when you're giving, make sure you're clear on which one it is. So it's helpful, because otherwise a lot of cognitive biases get in the way, which we will get into, and how to spot them so that you can distinguish between giving and getting good and bad advice. So is advice that you need to set your goals and be a gunner, create the habits and go for it? Or is one of the pieces of advice that you need mindfulness? You need to go with the flow. I'm not saying that they're the same, but there are things where a lot of good advice contradicts. Which one is meant for you? A or B? Anyone want to come out and share? All right. Number 2, advice that is not meant for you. So how do you know if you get or give advice that's better for someone else, maybe not for you? Like if you're giving advice, how do you know that the advice that you give from your perspective is really meant for the person you're giving it to? Same with the receiver. Okay, so we've got some good comments. There should be a balance between chasing goals and going with the flow, Arvin says. Fantastic. So when you get advice, how do you know? So you've got work, relax, life, go, go. Okay, so these kinds of things, it's important for you to think about what your own thinking and your own mental models before you see this advice that's just particularly at the beginning of the year, where everyone advises, this is how you have a good year. This is how we're going to leave last year behind. And this is the advice for having a good year. How do you know if that advice is meant for you? So I have several friends who are wildly successful, but they don't have any presence on social media. When I say any, I mean none, zero. Zilch. They've never built their personal brand, and the advice that they should try to do so would be bad advice for them. Their success has nothing to do with a lot of people admiring them. Nothing to do with it. So if I was giving advice to someone like that, it really wouldn't be meant for them to, here's how to build your social media. Here's how to get people to adore you. Here's how to be a thought leader. unless their situation changed, right? So they have to know whether that advice is for them, not because they just don't want to do it or they don't like it, but because it's not meant for them, right? So, how do you know when something is not meant for you versus you just don't want to do it because you're too lazy or you don't like it or whatever? All right. How would we know which works for us? Hatem says, how would we know? And that's a really good question because until you know what works for you, you don't know if that advice is for you, right? All right. So this is my, let's say it says, my best advice is for someone, respect yourself first of all. Okay. Excellent. Advice for me, if it's aligned with my goals. Same for giving advice. Is it aligned with the receiver's goal? Assuming neither of us have self-destructive goals. Absolutely. Excellent. Clear, clear, clear. What about advice you're not ready for? So we've got advice that's meant for you, advice that's not meant for you, and advice you're not ready for. So beware of seeking, and this goes to Ray's point, perfect segue. Beware of seeking to understand a goal before you understand yourself. Like when I was 6 years old, my goal was to be a mad scientist with a secret lab hidden behind a trap door, kind of like the one I saw on the Disney Channel, which was like so cool where you have all these potions and liquids and whatever. And then my second goal was to be Catwoman. I really wasn't ready for career advice. And that's a very obvious thing. But how often are we seeking to understand, gather advice before we really seek to understand not only our goal, but why we have that goal? All right. And that goes to whether we're looking for appreciation, looking for feedback, or looking for advice. Or we're ready to receive appreciation, we're ready to receive feedback, or we're ready to receive advice. Because feedback and advice are different. Now, I think when Harvard says, if you want feedback, ask for advice, it really has to do a lot with the fact that it's more fun to give advice than to give feedback. How many people think it is easier or more fun to give advice than to evaluate and give feedback? What would you rather give, advice or feedback? Question in the chat. Let me know. Okay, so does advice have to be actionable with a clear pathway to completion to be good? Because a lot of times you say, okay, advice needs to be actionable. Does advice need to be actionable? So I guess the main takeaway in looking at this is separating out appreciation, feedback, and advice, and then also beware of seeking advice about what to do before you know and think about your goals. Good advice requires thinking in advance to be clear on what we want to achieve and why. And while clearly setting out our goals, it will enable us to seek more relevant information, and it will also focus our minds on tasks that increase our chances of success. So if you follow these key steps to success, you better know what success looks like for you, not defined by someone else. You have to have clarity in what you mean. Maybe flourishing is a better word. How do you flourish? How do you flounder? How do you flourish? How do you languish? How do you flourish? And distinguishing between these two things. Okay, so this says, Tim says, it depends to whom I'm giving the advice. Absolutely. But make it clear. Do you think it could help to make clear or even clarify, do you want appreciation? Do you want feedback or evaluation? Or do you want advice? Do you think it would help to ask the receiver what they want, so that you make sure that you're lining up what they want with what you're providing? And same with as the receiver. Do you want to give me feedback? Are you looking more to give me appreciation, or do you want to offer advice? So when you think about giving or getting advice, there's different advice that comes to mind. Sometimes it's discreet. Do this. Sometimes it's counsel, it's coaching, it's mentoring. So think about these different kinds of advice. Discreet advice means exploring options for maybe a single decision. So recommendations for or against specific options. So if you're looking for discreet advice, you're saying, where should I move? Or which of these 2 job offers should I take? That's discreet advice. But sometimes you're seeking to give or get counsel. Like you want to, providing or receiving guidance on how to approach a complex situation or an unfamiliar situation. So how should I handle my feelings of isolation? That might be counsel. Or how should I deal with questions I have at work that I'm afraid to ask? that kind of thing. That could be counsel. Coaching, which can be similar but different, um, can involve enhancing skills and self-awareness and self-management. So, for example, how can I work more collaboratively with my peers, or how can I sell more of my services? That could be coaching advice. Maybe related to counsel, but you can kind of see it's a little bit different. And then there's the mentoring types of advice. How can I get more exposure for my project? How can I think about positioning my company? These are providing opportunities and guidance and protection to aid career or life success, that kind of thing. So, how do you distinguish between good and bad advice? So now you know whether you're seeking appreciation, feedback, or advice, right? Or you're giving it. Now, how do you distinguish? Once you've done that, what do you look out for? How do you distinguish? All right. So Barkley says feedback takes longer, but it's more interesting if I'm interested in the topic. You can learn more by giving feedback. I tend to agree. I think that people prefer to give advice because evaluation can be tricky. They don't want to offend people. And also, the recipient may not be ready for feedback, so they might be more receptive to advice. So I think advice is safer than feedback, maybe less, maybe less specific, because you're not saying, oh, you did this wrong or you did that wrong, but you're saying, oh, this is what I advise you to do in the future. So that distinction could be more comfortable. And feedback does take longer because it requires more precision, potentially. Advice can be platitudinal, like just these general work hard, never give up. Hussein says, advice is good as long as it solves problems. Does advice have to solve problems? Can you have good advice that doesn't solve problems? I don't know. That's a good point. I love it. Anyone want to weigh in? Weigh in. All right. Beware of seeking confirming advice because you think you already have the answers. And this is a little bit along the lines of seeking appreciation. You're secretly seeking appreciation or confirmation when you act like you're wanting advice, but you're really seeking confirmation. So related to this is to ask for advice when your goal is really to get validation or praise. We do this when we strongly believe we've solved the problem, but we still want to check the box of asking for advice with bosses or peers. Or we do it when we have lurking doubts about a solution, but we dread the time and attention it would take to do better, so that if we just get someone to confirm what we've done, we don't have to face the facts. So beware of seeking confirming advice, because when you do, you're going to be unable to distinguish between good and bad advice. And a lot of times we want to seek confirming advice. Trust me, I do too. It feels so much better. Separate the validity and quality of advice from the confidence of the advice giver. So if someone is super confident in giving you advice, beware of thinking that confidence equals competence. That's a very tricky thing. So if someone gives you definitive advice, beware of mistaking the confidence for competence. So Stephen says, let's see, where should one draw the line between advice and mansplaining and personsplaining? Okay. Now, if someone is asking for advice, then they are open to some explanation. But then as the giver, you might say, okay, would you be more interested in me telling you all the things you're doing well? So appreciation, more interested in me providing evaluation or feedback, which means there's some good and bad, or do you want more general advice? Now that clarification means that if they answer and then they accuse you of mansplaining or womansplaining or personsplaining, that's on them. Because you've asked them, how do you want to receive this? What are you really looking for? I think that gets a rubber shaken. I think that's a great question. All right. So the other thing is to consider advice separate from whether you generally agree with the advice giver or not. Advice seekers tend to assume that advice is not good when it veers from trendy norms or when it comes from people we disagree with. Advice seekers also don't embrace advice when advisors disagree among themselves. And there's a lot of kind of research about this. So, if you have a group of people and these advice givers all disagree, it makes it very difficult for you to know what's good and bad advice. But beware of dismissing advice because it goes against trend or it is provided by someone that in general you disagree with, because bad ideas and good ideas can stick to people you disagree with and people you agree with. So it's very important to evaluate, make sure that you don't put too much into the advice or dismiss the advice or take the advice just on feelings of affect, feelings of whether you like or dislike this person. That is actually called the affect heuristic. Okay. Also, beware of advice that starts with just. I love this one because it's so easy. So just do this or just do that or just keep grinding, just follow your bliss. It usually means the advice is too generic, prescriptive, and it's not that useful. Okay. So if you look for advice that has just this or just that, just do it. Nike's good advice. It's probably generic, platitudinal, and a little prescriptive. It's not necessarily good or useful advice. Doesn't mean it's bad. It's just not that useful. All right. So Jennifer says, I think you have to be careful how you ask for clarification. It could come across as rude. Ooh, good point. When you ask for that kind of clarification, it's 100%. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. So you say, okay, someone says, I really want advice on that. Okay, let me look at this. Now, I'm going to take this really seriously. I'm going to look at what you've done. Now, my question is, there's a lot of things I appreciate about it. There's some feedback I have, and I could take time evaluating it, or I could just give you more general advice. What would be more useful to you? It could totally come across as rude. And as a matter of fact, I think that's a really good point. A lot of things on how to do and how to think, if they're not done correctly, can come across the wrong way. So you have to think about how you would want that clarification received. But if you asked for that clarification in the same way you would want to receive it, that can be a hint in how it doesn't come across as rude. Now, maybe you're less sensitive. So, but you have to think about that as well. So now here's another thing. I think this is really interesting. This was some great research that came out that showed that if you're a powerful person, so you're a senior person, you're the boss, you have a very senior position, you're a manager, you're a leader. This one's really for you because studies have found that powerful individuals or more senior leaders often discount both novice and expert advice far more than people in less powerful positions. Which you think, okay, that's fine, but here's the clincher. Regardless of the quality of the advice. So they've done some research where they had the same quality of advice, good advice given by someone that's expert and given that someone's maybe a lower level position, same quality. And the more senior that person is or more powerful they perceive themselves to be, the more dismissive of advice they are in general, regardless of the quality of advice. So perhaps maybe, and the speculation was that powerful people feel competitive when they receive advice from other experts. And that might inflate their confidence and lead them to dismiss what the experts are telling them. But and also, here's another thing. Powerful people, even wildly successful people, don't necessarily provide better advice. It's not necessarily that they're holding back advice because they don't want you to know the secrets of success. It's just that they may not know the secrets of success because the things that they identify as what caused their success are the same things that might have caused other people, or they might have related or correlated, regardless of cause, might be correlated with people who have failed. So that's a very interesting thing. You think, I'm going to go I'm going to take the advice of people who have been successful. So you got to make sure, is this feedback appropriate for me? All right. So Maria says, I prefer advice because it serves as your guidance or an eye-opening to a certain issue or topic. It's like gathering others' points of view, but it's still up to you to agree or not. Excellent. Excellent. Perfect. All right. Also, beware of seeking advice that you'll likely ignore if it goes against what you already believe. And this is an example of when you're going for advice, you kind of want confirmation, you kind of want appreciation, but you think you're going to get it. Beware of asking for advice that you have no intention of listening to if it doesn't confirm what you're likely to do, because then people will not want to give you advice anymore. All right. Ray, ding, 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 rubber chicken, survivorship bias. So Ray makes a really good point, which is if you follow the prescriptions given by people who succeed because they think that these prescriptions are what caused their success, you also have to look at the stories of people who did those exact same things and were not successful. And most of the time, books and stories aren't written about those people unless it's a fantastic failure. So survivorship bias, in Ray's point, just means that We have the stories of the people who have survived, the people who have been successful, but we don't have the stories of the people who've done the same exact things because of luck or situations or whatever, timing, that had a different outcome. So beware of survivorship bias. Yes. All right. The final thing is, I mean, this is kind of a general way, final sort of, but it relates to the final things, is get comfortable with saying, I don't know. Because when you are comfortable saying, I don't know, either as an advice giver or receiver, you will be able to then parse out good advice from bad advice. Why? Does anyone want to take a shot at why? Why does being comfortable saying, I don't know, as a giver of advice or a receiver of advice, why does that help you separate out good and bad advice? Anyone want to take a stab at it? That's a tricky question. Again, it's a how to think question. I don't have all the answers, but I suspect that there's some truth in that. So let's see what you guys think. Now, we also know that the inability to say, I don't know, is a curiosity and critical thinking killer. It's kind of the one, because it fosters an environment where we borrow our advice from others without doing the necessary thinking. And I think there's a lot of this. I think it's very easy to borrow advice from others without doing the necessary thinking because we don't want to say, I don't know. And then once we borrow advice from others, maybe the people who vote the same way we do or look the same way we do, we borrow that advice and then we share our ill-considered advice out loud. Then we feel the need to defend our borrowed advice and opinions because we don't want to appear what? Like flip-floppers, inconsistent. So when we receive advice and we don't really think it through, but it's given to us by someone on our team and they don't say, I don't know. And you don't say, I don't know about this. I don't know about this advice. You don't question it. Everyone's doing it. Seems no harm in it. And now you come back and say, I don't even want to question that because we borrowed it. We didn't really think it through. And now we're stuck because we don't want to say, I don't know. So that's a very important thing, is to say, why is everyone doing this? Is this good advice for me? I don't know. I'm going to stop and think it through. I don't know. All right. And that is related to the last point, which is to learn to change your mind in the face of good evidence. So if you are giving advice and you are popular writing blog posts and on LinkedIn and YouTube, and you're giving advice on what to think and what to do, and this is what you need to do, and you're an expert in this, you still have got to be able to learn to change your mind in the face of good evidence. And that gets very tricky when you have made your life about a certain thing or you've made your brand about a certain thing. So, question, when was the last time you changed your mind on something? Well, if you're honest, it's probably a long time ago. I'm not talking about like, do I like this restaurant or that restaurant? I'm talking about something that you publicly put yourself out there as someone who stood for this. And I can think of something big. I'll confess. If you stick to the end, I'll confess. I'm not clear on it. I don't know on it, but it is something that I am kind of grappling with. And it's a big one. It's kind of, it's bothering me. So I'll share a little bit about this. But if we tend to accumulate knowledge and assume that even in the face of evidence to the contrary, we're right. The point is here to re-examine your conclusion and your attitude so that when someone has a better one, you can adopt it. And this is as an advice giver or an advice getter. If you just don't cling too heavily, don't tie the advice you give or the advice you receive to your person, to your identity. Separating this out, you're going to be able to know, when you're looking for appreciation, when you're looking for feedback, when you're looking for advice, and when you're looking to give these things. Because when you seek evidence that contradicts what you think and try to explain it, you're going to be able to separate out good advice from bad advice. And I will tell you, this is probably a little bit long for the end, but I'll be really quick. One of the things that I have thought is true forever and ever, I'm starting to change my mind about as I read a really great book that I recommend to people who want to know about quantum theory, but they're not physicists. They're just like regular non-math physics people who want to learn about the history of quantum theory, is a book called Helgoland. I highly recommend it. I listened to it on audiobook. The guy has a beautiful voice. But I have always thought that truth is truth. I didn't think you landed on truth, but I thought that things are true or they're not true. A fact is a fact. And reading Helgoland and reading and learning a little bit about the concept of entanglement might be the beginning of me changing my mind about that. And I don't like it. I don't like it. It's not the same as like your truth, my truth. That's not quite what I'm talking about. But learning about entanglement is making me change my mind about some things that I am not very comfortable, but I'm coming right out and admitting it. So if any of you read Helgoland and want to talk about entanglement, or if you know anyone who can talk about it in a way that we can apply it to our own lives, let me know, because we want to have some good interviews on the show in 2022. Anyway, hope you guys have a great launch at the beginning of the year. I hope now you know a little bit on tricks and tips for how to give and receive and differentiating between good advice and bad advice. I'll bring a few last minute comments in and then we'll say goodbye. All right. So Loya says, when we receive, I don't know, we might think that we are not the only people that don't know, and it may intrigue us to go further for the resolution. Yes, totally agree. And Tim says, Ben Franklin told Thomas Jefferson that he decided never to submit his work to any editors after one early incident in his youth. I don't remember that. I read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, which is another book I highly recommend. Interesting. Anyway, hope you guys have a great week. See you next Monday, 9 a.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, right here on LinkedIn Live and on YouTube Live. And if you're not clicked in, you can go to Becky Saltzman, subscribe, and hit that bell notification so that you can participate with other good thinkers from around the world who want to devote a little bit of time to improving how we think. Thanks.